How's it going, you guys? So in this video, I wanted to discuss evolution. This is a new topic that we are talking about, a new unit. And evolution, if you think about evolution, sometimes you're tempted to think about biological evolution, and that makes sense because we are talking about biology. But evolution really means a change in anything over time. So we could talk about the evolution of cars. We could talk about the evolution of the cell phone. We could talk about the evolution of dance. Any change in something over time is evolution. Now, because this is biology, it's appropriate to think about biological evolution, the change in life over time. And when you think about biological evolution, the person that normally comes to mind is Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin, I'll put a picture of him on the screen so you can see him. But Charles Darwin was born in February 12th, 1809, but when he was young, he studied to become a doctor. This is because his father was a doctor, and his father wanted him to kind of follow in his footsteps. So he studied to become a doctor. However, it didn't really work out because Charles Darwin was a little bit squeamish, so being a doctor was not the path for him. Instead, he was more fascinated by nature, so he became what is called a naturalist, someone who studies nature. And at the age of 22, in 1831 roughly, he had a chance to set sail on the HMS Beagle for a trip around the world. The primary purpose of this trip was to make maps, particularly of South America, but they wanted a naturalist to come on board, to collect specimens, to study them, and also to keep the captain company because the last captain of the HMS Beagle actually shot himself. So they wanted to make sure that this captain wasn't too lonely, right? So they brought Charles Darwin along to keep the captain company and to study nature, to study specimens, that kind of stuff. Now, before we talk about his voyage, I do want to talk about some other things that were going on at the time that Charles Darwin was growing up. So geologists, people who study the Earth, they were coming up with some claims at that time. So they were saying that based on their studies, they were discovering that the Earth is super old. So this is something that wasn't necessarily known about. The Earth was a lot older than they had anticipated. So this was something that geologists were claiming. The Earth was super old, and on top of that, the Earth was changing over time. So the Earth itself was evolving. Now, because of this, biologists of that time were also starting to jump on that bandwagon and say, well, if the Earth is super old, perhaps life is super old as well, and perhaps life was changing, right, or has changed over time. So the idea of biological evolution was not something that Darwin himself came up with. This was an idea before Darwin, but it wasn't fully accepted until Darwin came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection, which we'll talk about. So just some things to note that were going around, some ideas that were coming up in the early 1800s when Darwin was growing up. But beyond that, I want to talk about his voyage. So let me see if I can get this whole map in here. So I drew a map of his voyage. There we go. All right. So this is a map of the world. Charles Darwin, he was born in England, so he was an English scientist, an English naturalist. And so when he set sail on the HMS Beagle, they started off in England, right? So up here, part of Europe, England, and so he, as well as the entire ship, set sail through the Atlantic Ocean. They eventually reached South America. So they stopped at the border of South America. They continued traveling around South America. They stopped in places like Argentina. Their most famous stop was perhaps the Galapagos Islands. So as they sailed around South America, they stopped at this group of islands called the Galapagos Islands. This is something that's super important. You guys should remember the Galapagos Islands. So Darwin's most famous stop, just off the coast of Ecuador. And this is where he made some of his most famous discoveries. This is where he discovered the tortoises that are very famous in his journey, the finches that were very famous in his journey. We'll get back to those either later in this video or perhaps in another video. But after the Galapagos Islands, he continued to sail west. And as you guys know, the Earth is round, so he will pop back out on the other side of the Earth. He stops in New Zealand. He stops in Australia a few times. He continues to sail past the Indian Ocean. He stops in Africa, right on the coast, I should say. He continues to sail to South America, and then finally, once they kind of have their bearings, they set sail back to England. So that was his entire journey, his entire voyage, right? And he anticipated, when they first set sail, that this journey would last no more than 2 years. It turns out that this entire journey took them a total of 5 years. So more than double of what they initially thought the journey would take. So it was quite the journey, quite the voyage, but they stopped in many famous spots. They stopped all over the world, collecting specimens, analyzing specimens, and after this journey, that was when Darwin made his most famous claims about evolution by natural selection. But he actually didn't publish these results until 20 years after the voyage. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But I do want to mention 3 big observations that he made. And they all tie into this one concept of variation. So he noticed that species varied all over the world. So let me bring you over here. So he noticed that species varied all over the world. And not only all over the world, but they also varied locally. So they varied globally, they varied locally, but they also varied over time. So the species that we saw in the past were not the species that we were seeing today. So for instance, species vary globally. He noticed that, for instance, kangaroos were only found, naturally speaking, in Australia. Right? Australia is where most kangaroos are. That marsupial mammals, which are what kangaroos are, they exist primarily in Australia, or in that region. Whereas rabbits, for instance, he was familiar with the European rabbit, found in Europe, and he noted that the environments for Australia, where the kangaroos lived, and Europe, where the rabbits lived, they were kind of similar. So rabbits probably could have done well in Australia, and perhaps kangaroos could have done well in Europe. However, you only find kangaroos in Australia and rabbits in Europe. So this was something that he thought was interesting, something that he noted as part of the species vary globally observation that he made. But he also noticed that species vary locally. So we talked about the Galapagos Islands, and we talked briefly about the tortoises that lived on those islands. So I'll include some pictures, but if you look at Hood Island tortoises, Hood Island has shrubbery that's further up, so it's a little bit harder to reach. So if you look at the tortoises on that island, they tend to have much longer necks than, let's say, the tortoises on Isabella Island, another island within the Galapagos Islands. Isabella Island, if you look at the shrubbery on that island, it's closer to the ground. So naturally, the Isabella Island tortoises have a shorter, stubbier neck, right? So they don't need to have a long neck to reach the high up shrubs when they can grab the shrubs that are closer to the ground. So right there, you see that species, even though they are local, even though they're in the same general area, the Galapagos Islands, they do still vary, even locally. And also, species vary over time. So one thing that Darwin did, in addition to collect specimens, was he also collected fossils. The remains of an old organism, or perhaps the imprint of an organism that had once lived however many years ago and is no longer alive today. But one thing that he noted is the fossils that existed however long ago were not resembling organisms that live today. So for instance, I'll include a picture of this as well, the glyptodont. So the glyptodont was an organism that lived however many years ago, and the glyptodont was this large shelled organism. Now, in present day, you see armadillos. Armadillos are kind of similar, but they are not nearly as large as glyptodonts, but they are what are alive today, and they are the thing that most closely resembles the glyptodont that existed however many years ago. So just looking at the glyptodont and the armadillo, you can see that species vary over time. So these were the major observations that Darwin came up with in his voyage, and we'll talk about how they all kind of tie in at the end when he comes up with his big idea of the theory of evolution by natural selection. So stay tuned for later videos on Darwin. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment them below, shoot me an email. You guys know what to do.